My story, I do so realizing everyone here has their own interesting story. So I asked you, how long should I make it? She don't know, they want to hear it all. So if anything gets long, you know who to blame. So how did I get here? I, like many of you, made choices in life, and I really, when I had to choose my career, in those days, in 1966, it was a lot easier to get into schools you wanted to get into rather than today. And my mother was mentally ill, and I really couldn't go home again. She really wanted me out of the house. And I had very good teachers. American high school made sure everybody in that high school went somewhere. Military, technical school, college, everybody had a career path. It was quite an institution. And I had a physics teacher named Mr. Engelhardt. I was not a good physics student, but he liked me and I helped him after school with the lab. I had a guidance counselor who told me to aim high, and I got into Georgetown University School of Nursing, and I got into RISD for art. I had no idea how an artist made a living. I really didn't, even though I lived right outside New York and had been able to go to the Metropolitan and see wonderful artists. There were artists that lived throughout the community, including John Cometti, who's a very famous sculptor, actually lived up the hill from me and had his features that looked like Martians in his lawn. But I went to Georgetown, and Georgetown at that time was a Jesuit university, and the only women there were in the School of Nursing and in the School of Language and Foreign Service. So we were the minority in the university, and we had a very good time. Georgetown at that time was one of the first 5-year baccalaureate programs. Nursing was going through a transition to try to legitimize more the profession, and all my instructors had PhDs. Not in nursing, because they didn't offer a PhD in nursing in 1966, but they had it in psychology, they had it in administration. So the women who taught me were top-notch, and they taught us in a way that really met my very right-brained brain. I am totally right-brained. The story was tested one time, and my husband has to put up with it because I break every system that I create. He's totally left-brained, so we make a whole brain. That's why we're celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary soon. At Georgetown, it was very clear that the patient was your priority. No matter what you had to do, no matter what rule you had to break, you had to have the knowledge and the guts to make sure that the patient came first. We actually had therapy classes where we talked about the pressures of being nursing. We had economic classes to talk about why nurse practitioners, and at those days it was a nurse practitioner, it was actually nurse midwifery, was an economic threat to doctors. It was quite an education and a very, gave me a very good standing in terms of how to do my job. And it also was a Jesuit university, and we had those old-fashioned caps. One peak was Hope, Faith, and Charity, and that was, we had the pins, we had the whole 9 yards. But we also gave us guts, and they said you need to know what you're doing, and you need to make sure the patient always comes first. And that has gotten me to use my right brain a lot of times in my profession. The biggest thing I remember at Georgetown, besides the wonderful academics and the wonderful teachers, was that I met Dr. Kubler-Ross, who did the first really research on death and dying. And we were in an auditorium probably twice the size of this, with all the big wigs in medicine and the residents and the interns, and then our class had only 30 people in it, so we weren't a big group, but all the professors. And Kubler-Ross did her theory on death and dying and talked about the stages of anger and denial and the whole 9 yards. And then they had to open it up to the whole group, and they talked about, you know, what could the medical center do. And one person started talking about the nurses stealing the morphine from the patients. And all of a sudden, all my professors stood up and walked out. We all walked out with them because they weren't going to take it. And I always remember that these ladies, you know, in this huge auditorium, when they got insulted, just weren't going to put up with it, and they walked out. And they did get a letter from the president of the university apologizing for what had happened. But Kubler-Ross's theory of death and dying really stayed with me. And as I said, it was a very smart group of women, and they put us where our talents were. Some of my colleagues in my class in nursing were very technically attuned. Some of us were more mental health in tune. So if there was a dying patient or a patient that was very upset or family was upset, that was my assignment. And then somebody else may have the more complicated IVs and stuff like that. And I remember very distinctly that that was kind of my niche and kind of my use of my right brain in terms of how could I make the system, the patient better. Kubler-Ross, well, that was the beginning of her in 1966, and it took a long time for her theories on how to treat people who were dying, hospice, to really grow. Hospice had always been in the religious communities, but not really in the general hospitals or things like that. After I got out of Georgetown, I will tell you, I did not give up my passion for art when I was at Georgetown. I got a job with the Jane Haslam print gallery. Jane Haslam was a very famous gallerist who had a very fancy print gallery in Georgetown, and I sold artwork. That was my side job, and then I graduated from Georgetown. She asked me to stay on as the director of the gallery, but I had this degree in nursing, and I felt too guilty to say, no, I was going to work as a gallerist, I wasn't going to go on. And I got an NIMH scholarship to go to NYU for my master's degree in parent-child nursing. They weren't nurse practitioners in those days. In 1970, nursing was really trying to become its own independent thing, and it kind of went like the pendulum that way. And it was a good degree to get. I became a clinical specialist in parent-child nursing. Fred and I got married. He was finishing his master's in teaching. And we quickly found out that we couldn't really live on a nurse's and a teaching salary in Larchmont, New York. It was not going to happen. And we had summered in Maine, and we came, and Fred found his job in Pittsfield. So Fred actually taught for 2 years, or 1 year, and at the middle school, and then he went to law school, and he commuted, and I stayed here. And I had different jobs. I worked at Eastern Maine, I worked at Mid-Maine, I worked for the Mental Health Center, and all of it kind of gathered up. But one day I got fired. I got fired from Eastern Maine. In those days, when they brought in a new director of nursing, they kind of cleaned house. And the underling or assistant directors of nursing kind of went away. So all of a sudden one night, 12 of us were without a job. And I started my antique shop, which some of you may have remembered, that was next to Fred's office. And I was on the school board. And I was pretty happy. I was okay. And Terry McCown, who was the administrator of the school system, then said, I want a master's level nurse to be the school nurse. At that time, there were 780 students and 75 staff in the school system. We're not counting MCI. And one nurse was to do it all. And in those days, we had no ambulance service all the time. The ambulance could be going to a nursing home, taking a patient, blah, 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 blah. So I asked Joan Stevens, who was a master's level nurse, whether she would like to take it. And she said, no, thank you, I've just gotten a new job and I'm really not interested. So I went to Terry McCown and I said, sorry, Terry, she's not interested, and I don't really know any other master's level nurses who are clinical who are looking for a job. And he turns to me and says, well, what about you? And I said, well, and I said, It's usually a 25-year job for being a school nurse. Once you get it, you kind of never leave. And leave your house before me. I've been there for almost 30 years. So I said, maybe. And I went home and announced to my family that I was thinking of taking this job. And Tara said to me, oh, my dead body, do you realize that your office is going to be where I'm going to be going to school? Do you think I want my mother in the office in my school building? Not on your life. And I said, sorry, honey, it's a 25-year job, and it's very interesting. It'll use all my systems work. It will allow me to, take care of a lot of people. And what you may not know is I took an EMT course really quickly because there was no way I was going to take care of 780 kids with having a little more assessment background without backup of a doctor or a way to get a kid up to the ER quickly because the ambulance was out of town delivering a person to the nursing home. So that's kind of how I became a school nurse. And I did that for 20 years, and it was a wonderful job. And I had wonderful help with all the secretaries and the teachers, and with Rosemary Springer, who was my godsend, who worked for me part-time, but that's all my budget would allow, and she kept me in order. And she developed my systems for me in terms of being on the computer, blah, 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 blah. And it was a wonderful job. But when I lost Tara and had to go back, it was very hard because many of her peers were coming back as student teachers, and it was really hard to see them. And the other thing was I felt that the staff didn't want to bother me or put pressure on me because of the loss, and that's when I retired. So after I retired, I had to figure out what the heck I was going to do, and my love for art, I had collected for many years. We gave some of the collection to the public library, we're giving some of it to Bates now. But I decided I was going to go back to art school. And having a very supportive husband of almost 50 years, he said, go for it. So I went down to Mecca, and for a short while before that I worked for public health. I'm going to add this little vignette in it because it's important in terms of COVID. Public health nursing in Maine, as you remember, under the last governor, was cut to pieces. They went down from 55 nurses to 35. What public health nursing does in Maine is take care of high-risk pregnancies and high-risk babies, or babies that have complicated surgeries and they need help afterwards. And they also do active TB. And TB is in Maine. And we have a WHO, World Health contract with WHO, that every TB patient in Maine has to be visited every day by a public health nurse to make sure they take their pills. Because in the 70s, TB became intractable, and they didn't have any antibiotics at that time to take care of it, and people were actually put into insane asylums so they wouldn't spread it. So this very non-technical person had to learn to use one of those negative hoods and full gowns, go to somebody's house, full gowned up, get swab samples, put them in the tube, try not to contaminate themselves, which maybe took 45 minutes, and get it back, get the sample taken, and then the doctors would decide what treatment and go visit them. And why we have TB in Maine is that we have more and more treatment for cancer, so many people who are immunosuppressed travel. They go to the islands, they go to South America, where TB is rampant, and they come back with it. So a lot of my patients were professors and lawyers and very middle-class people who had picked up TB when they traveled because they had been traveling after they were immunosuppressed. Does that make sense? So that was part of the job. The other part of the job was babies. So I went and I took my classes, and I found a mentor, Diane Delkey, and I applied to get into Mecca, and I almost did not get in. I got voted by most of the old ladies and staff who were professors, and I will tell you they were old ladies, didn't want me in because I didn't have my baccalaureate in fine arts, but there were people who pushed for me and I got in. And it was a very interesting 2-year journey. They don't teach you any skills. It's all very theoretical and how to present your work and how to talk about your work, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a really wonderful ride. I learned an awful lot, and I continue to increase my skill set. So that's how I come here with this work. It is based on the concept that when we face tremendous odds and tremendous bad things, that our minds work very differently. And I think it was 2018 when I was trying to think about my thesis, because you have to write a thesis for an MFA, it's a terminal degree. I was reading Time magazine, and they interviewed all these people who had lost their children to gunmen, all the parents who had survived the children being slaughtered. And they all said the same thing, that their first reaction when they heard that the child had died was like a balloon with a string being cut, and then everything went white. They couldn't see, they couldn't hear, they couldn't function. And then after that stage was gone, and they kind of were semi-mobile, they lived in a very fractured world. They would get up in the morning to make their child their breakfast, but there was no child. They would go to the bus stop to pick up their child, but there was no child. And they lived with this fracturing for years and years and years, and they were very embarrassed about it because their functionality was not very good. And I'm sure all you that have had losses in your life have experienced this to some point or another. So this concept of fracturing and this concept of dealing with how your mind changes when you deal with a death of a loved one or your impending death is pretty universal. They've studied this after the Holocaust, psychiatrists have studied it, and they found that people go through the same thing, no matter what their culture, no matter what their background, no matter what their education. There's a period of blankness, and then there's a period of being very fractured. And then there's a period of healing where you incorporate that fracturing into a new way of being. So the work you're going to see out there is based on fracturing. When I was in the pandemic, I was living in Portland. I was taking classes at USSM to increase my tools in my tool chest, and all of a sudden that was gone. And I was living with a very elderly and aged dog that had to be walked. And I'd walk out to the street with my mask on, my whole thing, and people would be smoking. And I could see, or they would be vaping, and I could see the vape and smoke come across the street, and I could smell through my mask. Well, having been a nurse, I was going holy S-H-I-T, and I was very, very frightened. But I wasn't in the blank stage because it wasn't like I was dying right now. It was more the frightening stage of my possible impending death. So the first piece you'll see as you go into the hallway is my first piece I made. I made it in 5 pieces of wood, and one side, I think it's called the expendables, which is all the old ladies who look like they're very ill. And the other side is the May 23rd Time magazine, New York Times article on the 100,000 deaths of May 23rd, 2020. And it has become a very famous article because they listed all the people, and they listed what they were and who they were. And that article, if you look it up on your phone or your computer, you can read many people talking about how important it was because it humanized the death toll. It wasn't just we lost, these number of people. It was Joe Smith and Marianne so-and-so, very common people and very famous people who had died. And that's when I decided to do some work. And thank goodness I have my own Zoom group, quick group that we've made. We're all artists who are in different stages. And every 2 weeks, we have to just make a piece of work to talk about. And nobody wants to be embarrassed and not have something to show. So all this work that you'll see is all from last year. It is my fracturing, my trying to get a handle on it, and kind of knowing too much. Because in February, when I read about this virus coming, and all the parents, which I understand completely, running to Europe to get their kids out of Europe, all I could say is, SHIT, this is gonna spread like wildfire. Because they're bringing it back and no one really knew how much it could spread. And at that time, we had leadership that wasn't going to mandate masks or whatever. And we didn't know exactly how it would spread. We figured it would spread respiratory-wise, how much touching-wise we weren't sure. But I knew we were in trouble. And that's the downside of being in the medical profession or having a brain. All of you have taken biology. All of you probably figured it out a long time ago. You know, everybody who has any common sense can read the basic science and know if you breathe on somebody and you got something, or you're smoking and coughing, you're going to spread it. But somehow our whole universe didn't catch up on that. So in January, when the vaccine of this year, when the vaccine became more available to us people who were 70 and older, I dragged Fred up to Presque Isle. I said, we're going on a trip. And the only way I could get 2 shots together through Northern Lights was to go to Presque Isle, because the time you got one person's name in, you couldn't get the second person's name in, and they were wonderful. So we had our trip out of the state, not out of state, but out of town to Presque Isle. We looked out with the weather, we got vaccinated. But I don't think it's over yet. Hopefully we're on the cusp that it will be over. But I think we will all have to remember that it can happen again and rejoice with each other. And for me, it was just a way of making work that was meaningful for me. I have a website, it's mildredbachrach.com, so it's not very difficult to find. And the first series I made when I was in grad school was called Women's Ills. And I kind of wanted to memorialize all the women I saw as a public health nurse in Central Maine who were glued to their families and put up with derogatory remarks like wound too tight, or I pick it out of my brains, hanging from a thread, or bogged down. And there are soft sculptures on that site you can look at that to memorialize the women who, you know, took care of all the kids and worked or didn't work and really glued the families together. So I am now what we call scrubbing the studio. When you make a series of work as an artist, at least for me, I need to show it and put it away so I can make a new series. I already have a new series in mind. I have endless series in mind. That's one of the problems of being an artist. You always have something in your mind. You always are thinking about what you want to do next. But this work was shown virtually by the Jewish Museum, and it was shown partially in person at the LA Arts Gallery in Lewiston, Maine. And it was mentioned, I had 2 articles on it from the Maine Arts Journal. So it has gotten some press, or what do you want to call it, accolades. It may be the pinnacle of my career. I have no idea. But I appreciate you let me scrubbing in the studio and showing it to you in person, because they've never been able to be seen all together, only online, which is one image at a time. And I wanted to show you my reaction to the pandemic, the fracturing that I felt, the ode to the people who died. And then I have one group, it's called Hope, Faith, and Charity, which I figured out last night was the same saying as my Georgetown cat, which was Hope, Faith, and Charity, that I did in between because I couldn't stand making another fractured piece in terms of being depressed. And there is a piece there called Are We There Yet? And I think we are almost there yet, but it's coming. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.